I'm Danica, and I'm going to be talking about explanations in regards to the categorization of people. So what do people want to know about a decision when they themselves are the data subject of an algorithmic decision-making process? So the motivation for this study comes from the introduction of the European Union's general data regulations. Some experts believe that within those regulations, there's this idea of a right to an explanation when an algorithm makes a decision about a person using their personal data. This right is not explicitly within the regulations, but experts believe it can be inferred from a number of different clauses, such as Articles 13 and 14, which say when a person is profiled, they have a right to meaningful information about the logic involved. And then Article 22 further says a decision cannot be based solely on automated processing and requires a right to human intervention in the case of disputes or lack of clarity. Now, seeing as this right to an explanation is not explicit in the regulations, there is no clear definition or guide as to what a meaningful explanation actually requires. Articles 13 and 14 point to the idea that meaningful information about the logic involved is required, but what does that actually mean in this context? What information is meaningful to a person such that they feel like they understand the logic involved in the automated decision-making process? That is what we set out to explore. So, what does the general public expect in an explanation when an algorithm makes a decision about their person? To answer this question, we conducted 21 semi-structured interviews with members of the general public. The only inclusion requirement was that they be 18 or older and speak English. About half our sample were students, both graduate and undergraduate, but we were able to gain the participation of members of the larger community of various backgrounds and demographics. So for the interviews themselves, we would give each participant 2 to 3 different scenarios, such as their credit card was flagged for fraud or they were applying for a job online. And in most of the scenarios, the decision would be made by a system. And the outcome that we would present would be an unexpected negative one, as opposed to a positive outcome, just because that provokes more interest in the participants as to what happened. All right, so before I get into some of our findings, I just want to note that they are preliminary findings based on a sample of 8 of the interviews, as this project is still ongoing. And the first thing I want to talk about is the delivery. And one of the things we asked participants about was extent and complexity. And this is relevant in the case of artificial intelligence and automated decision making, especially because these systems can be quite complex, as we're all, I'm sure, familiar with this idea of a black box, and that as a system becomes more advanced, it becomes more opaque and harder to understand, especially by non-experts. So we were asking participants if they would prefer that the explanation be shorter and easier to understand using layman's terms, or would they want an explanation that was more complex, longer, more robust, and included some of that technical information and technical language? And all of the participants noted that they thought that both types of explanation should be available, but most thought that a priority should be given to a shorter, easier to understand explanation, as they felt that a lot of people would not have the technical knowledge to be able to understand and utilize a more complex explanation. And then we also asked about who they would want to deliver the explanation and in what mode, so like a phone call or an email. And in terms of mode, that was one that varied a lot by context. So it's very context specific. So an example of a credit card being flagged by fraud, most people seem to want a phone call, but in the context of applying for a job, an email or letter seem to be more appropriate. So that's very context dependent, as is who is delivering the explanation. In some cases, participants felt a system was adequate, especially in the case where they felt like they understood why the decision was happening in the first place. But if they had questions or they were unsure of what happened, then they would want to talk to a person. And that seemed to be because they believed that a person would be more flexible and be able to better understand the nuance of their situation and possibly either at least look at the decision more closely or possibly make a change. And then lastly, we looked at timing, which I'll get more into in a moment, whether participants thought that the explanation should come before the process itself or after the decision itself was made. So when we're talking about an explanation that comes before the process itself happens, it's a bit more limited than an explanation that comes after the decision is made because it can't comment on a decision that hasn't been made yet. So information that could be included in such an explanation is information about the process itself, what's the reasoning, what kind of factors are they going to look at, how does that process work. It can also include information about the system itself, what kind of system is being run, who built the system. Participants did note they'd want to be informed that a system was making the decision. That in itself is important. And then you can also look at who is responsible for the decision. So a system may be making the decision, but who's behind that? Who has the final say? Who's programming that system in order to make that kind of decision? It can also include information about data use. So what data do they have access to? How are they accessing your data? What are they using it for? Why are they using it? And who else could have access to that data? Is it being sold to third parties, and what are they using it for? And particularly related to that idea of data use is a couple participants brought up this idea of consent, that they thought that this explanation beforehand was important because they felt like, especially because their personal data was being used, that they should have to provide meaningful, informed consent. And then when we look at an explanation that's provided after the fact, it can provide a lot of the same information, but it can also tell us about why the decision was made. So when participants were asked, what would you want to know in this scenario, almost always they would say, why? Why was I denied credit? Why was I unsuccessful in my application? Why was I flagged for fraud? And what they were really looking for here is, what was the deciding factor? What was the singular reason or reasons why I was unsuccessful in this decision process? And that's a little bit different than an explanation that includes the logical process itself. That could include a list of all of the factors that were looked at. How were they weighted? Was one factor more important than another? As well as what data was used, what information was this based on? It would be a more robust explanation. And some participants were interested in that as well. After that initial, what was the reason why I was unsuccessful? And then two other types of explanations that came up was a comparison. So especially in the case of something like an application for a job, people wanted to know, well, what does a successful application look like? What is it about them that made them successful that I don't have? Which is similar to this idea of a counterfactual, which is where you give an explanation of what would have happened if something were different. So, for example, when students apply for credit, and if they're unsuccessful, well, what would have happened if they weren't a student? And so all of these types of explanations came up in various scenarios throughout the different interviews, but by far I would say that so far the two most important would be the deciding factor or factors, as well as then following up with more information about the logical process itself, which, if we go back to the motivating interest for this study with the right to an explanation in the general data protection regulations, that's one of the reasons why an explanation would be useful in the case of a conflict or discrepancy, or if something's unclear. Then you want to know the reasons why so that you can follow up about that and possibly dispute it. And that is all of the time that I have now, so I will pass along to my next presenter.